Hello, welcome to Stories for Wonderful Children, the podcast where I share the recordings of the bedtime stories I've improvised for my children over the years. I'm Dan Wendelin, your host and storyteller. For almost 20 years, I made up a new story for my children every night at bedtime. Many of those stories were recorded, and now I'd like to share the very best of those with you. I hope you enjoy these stories for wonderful children. Tammy and her mommy and her daddy and Lorenzo the Roadrunner took off with their aluminum can, what?
Tin can Roadrunner.
With their tin can Roadrunner statue early the next morning and began to find a wind to take them north. Tammy's daddy had brought several suitcases on board, and he began to show Tammy the souvenirs that he had picked up. There were several typical kind of things. He had a thimble that said Uruguay on it for Tammy's mommy, and he had a little Uruguayan hat for Tammy. And he hadn't brought Lorenzo the Roadrunner anything because he hadn't known that Lorenzo was going to be with him. And he'd gotten himself a sort of colorful poncho. And then he had a suitcase. Her daddy was a rock collector, and he had been collecting some interesting rocks. Really pretty blues and greens, reds, some really beautiful rocks. And they went up and they started to drift north. And they'd been drifting north for about an hour when Tammy looked behind them, and she saw that far back in the distance there was something else floating in the sky, and she couldn't quite see what it was. So she got out her spyglass, which let her see things at a distance, and she opened it up, and she looked back, and in the spyglass, the thing leaped large so that she could see it, and she saw that it was a blimp with propellers on the back. And on the side of the blimp was painted a big black pirate flag. She said, and she clicked her spyglass closed. She said, "Mommy, Daddy, Mommy, Daddy, Mommy, Daddy." And they said, "What, Tammy?" She said, "Pirates!" And her mommy said, "Pirates?" And Lorenzo said, "Ark?" And her daddy said, "Oh no. How did they find out that I was leaving?" And her mommy said, "What?" And he said, "Well, some of the stones I collected. One day, I walked way out to the city, and I collected these stones, and I was walking back along a road, and these two rabbits, dressed as pirates, jumped out and said, 'We're jackal pirates, and you need to hand over everything you've got.' I said, 'You're rabbits. I'm not giving you my rocks. I spent all day collecting these.' And they drew out cutlasses, which are pirate swords. And they said, 'Well, the jackals will be here soon.' And I listened, and I could hear the arr, 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 arr sound of jackals coming. And so I ran. And the rabbits, which are usually pretty fast, couldn't catch me because they were slowed down by their cutlasses. And I ran all the way back into the city. And I have been very careful not to be seen by the pirates, because there are a lot of pirates in that city. But they must have seen me leaving, and now they must want my stones." And Tammy said, "Well, they've got propellers on their blimp. They're going to catch us." And her daddy borrowed her spyglass, and he looked. And her mommy borrowed her spyglass, and she looked. And they both looked a little worried. And then Lorenzo went, "Ark, ark, 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 ark," until Tammy finally figured out what he wanted, and she held up the spyglass, and Lorenzo looked, first with one eye, and then he turned his head and looked with the other eye. And then he seemed satisfied, and he sat in the bottom of their balloon. "What are we going to do?" And her mommy and daddy shrugged. They said, "Well, we'll just have to keep on this north wind and hope they don't catch us." And Tammy said, "That's it? That's our plan?" And they said, "Well, if you've got a better plan, well, I'd like to hear it." And Tammy said, "Well, we've still got those lassos. Let's look around for some geese. Maybe we can lasso some geese and get moving faster. And so, as they drifted along, looking back at the pirate blimp slowly growing behind them, they looked for geese. They did not see any geese, or swans, or any other large birds that they could lasso to pull them along. They saw some small birds, but that was nothing that they could throw a rope over. So they looked ahead, and Lorenzo was doing something funny. He was walking around the tin can Roadrunner, and he was tapping on it. Tap, 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 tapping on different parts of it. And after a while, he seemed satisfied, and he went and lay down in the bottom of the balloon. And they looked back, and the pirate blimp had gotten close enough that they could now see the pirate flag on it with their naked eyes without using the spyglass. But then they looked up ahead, and they could see something else. And as they drifted towards it, they could see that up ahead of them was a great fog bank. And they were drifting straight towards it, and soon they drifted in among the fog. And they couldn't see more than a few feet outside the balloon. It was very quiet, and Tammy said, "Quick, Mommy, Daddy, we should change directions so the pirates can't find us." And so that's what they did. They let some air out of the balloon so it quietly sank. They didn't get too close to the ground, though, because they didn't want to run into something in the fog. And as they sank, they found a wind that blew them sort of a little more to the west. So they were going north and west. And they drifted through the fog for an hour, and for an hour and a half. And then they could just begin to hear the faint sound of and they knew that it was the sound of the engines on the pirate blimp, and it was getting closer. And they all got very quiet. They sat quietly in the bottom of the blimp, and now but the propeller sound was as loud as it got, and it was above them, and it wasn't moving towards them. It was getting quieter. The pirate blimp had missed them in the fog, and they drifted on through that fog. It was a thick fog bank, and they stayed in it until it was starting to get dark, and then it started to lift just a little bit, enough that they could see the ground, and they landed in a clearing in the jungle, and they rolled the balloon up so that it would be hard to see from the air, and then they slept in the basket of the balloon that night, and they never made a fire. They just ate their food cold from the icebox, so that if the pirates were still around, they wouldn't be able to see their fire. But they never heard the pirate blimp again that night, and they had a good night's rest. And tomorrow night, I will tell you about what happened next.
Thanks for listening to Stories for Wonderful Children. I created today's story, but heckling and clever commentary were supplied by my children. The theme music was created by Brandon Thompson, and the logo was designed by Silas Wendelin. If you know someone who might enjoy the stories, please tell them about the show. Our website is storiesforwonderfulchildren.com, and preview snippets are posted to most social media. I'm Dan Wendelin, reminding you to tell someone you love a story.